We are ready to get started. If you could find your seat. My question organizers are While my question organizers are hard at work, let me introduce our panel. Their full credentials are described on the sheets, which should be circling among you. Joel Eisen is apparently a celebrity among us. He's a professor of law, received his Doctor of Jurisprudence from Stanford and a degree in civil engineering from MIT. One of his teaching and research specialties is environmental and energy law, and his interests include brownfields, global warming regulation, and laws favoring alternative energy sources. Mike Harrison completed his doctoral studies at the University of Florida as an associate professor of geography and environmental studies. He is a statistical hydroclimatologist, of course, who specializes in rainfall variability in the tropics as it relates to El Nino and southern oscillation. Malcolm S. Hill is an evolutionary ecologist in the biology department with a doctorate from the University of Houston. His work focuses on marine sponges, and he is currently examining consequences of projected increases of sea surface temperature on marine communities in the Chesapeake Bay and the Florida Keys. Dr. David Kitchen, who is in the School of Continuing Studies, received his doctorate from Queen's University in North Ireland. He investigates and teaches environmental studies and earth sciences and has a special interest in geological aspects of global warming and climate change. Professor Peter D. Smallwood, who did his doctoral work at the University of Arizona, is a behavioral ecologist in the biology department. He has published work on the foraging and breeding behaviors of spiders, falcons, and squirrels. Professor Smallwood has worked in science policy at state, federal, and international levels. Professor Andy Yates, Associate Professor of Economics, earned his doctorate at Stanford University. His research is in environmental policy, political economy, and the intersection between them, and he teaches environmental economics and statistics at Richmond. And last but not least, Professor Thaddeus Williamson, Assistant Professor of Leadership Studies, received his doctorate in political science from Harvard. His research interests include sprawl, the evaluation of political and economic institutions, and social justice. He has written widely on environmental issues. And my name again is Don Forsyth. I'm a social psychologist in the Jepson Leadership School. I have my first question to put to the panel. Have you read Crichton's State of Fear? He proposes that global warming is a hoax and uses his usual wide array of references to support his science fiction. Is there scientific consensus on global warming? What are the key issues debated?
Okay, somebody has to start. Can you hear me okay? First of all, you have to deal with my strange accent, so I get used to it now and we can move on. I'm a geologist, so my perspective in this is one of what's happened in the past up to what's happened today. Mike and the others can carry on and tell you more in detail about what's happening today in terms of climate. What I can tell you for sure, and I have read Michael Crichton's book, and actually I enjoyed it, as I enjoyed most of Michael Crichton's book, but I did sort of squirm at some of the science inside it, especially when he was brought up to testify in front of Congress about climate change as opposed to other climate scientists, but that's another issue. Yes, climate has changed. Yes, climate is changing. From a geological perspective, the status quo is not an option. 10,000 years ago, New York was under 1,000 meters or so of ice or more. 10,000 years ago, the sea level was 300 feet lower than it is today. The seashore would have been somewhere around the margins of the continental shelf today. So the climate is changing. If you ask any scientist the question, is climate going to stay the same? You will get 100% consensus, yes, climate is not going to stay the same. as we approach closer to the current day, then ask the questions, and my colleagues will carry on from this, is the warming we're seeing today entirely the consequences of us? Is it anthropogenic, is the term we use for that? And there is some debate about how much that, how great that anthropogenic effect is. However, if we ask the question, as we saw in the film, are we seeing significant increases in the concentration of atmospheric carbon dioxide up to levels that we haven't seen, unprecedented in the geological past? Then the answer to that is certainly yes. If we ask then the question, is carbon dioxide a greenhouse gas, and do we expect to see an increase in atmospheric temperatures as a consequence of increased concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? The answer to that is yes. So what I'm trying to say is it doesn't really matter if we're at fault or not, but the climate is changing. And what can we do about it? Well, the one thing that we have some control over is carbon dioxide, or our carbon dioxide emissions, and the control of carbon dioxide levels. And methane is not, carbon dioxide is not the only one, and there are other minor gases too. That is certainly something we can do. So in some ways it's a red herring to ask, in my opinion, a red herring to ask the question. I personally think, yes, most of that carbon dioxide is produced by us, there's no question about that. In my opinion, most of the heating and warming we're seeing is anthropogenic in the last part of the century. But it doesn't matter. What we're seeing here is such a rapid geologically, this is my geology hat, and then I will pass on. Geologically speaking, what we're seeing with certainty, and I'm happy to say this, is more rapid climate change now than we've seen at any time in the last many millions of years. We're in an ice age now from a geologist's perspective for the last 4 million years or so. Every 40,000 to 100,000 years, we've had ice advances and ice retreats. And the big scheme that isn't going to stop. Our ultimate destiny some thousands of years from now is back with 1,000 feet of ice on top of New York again. You may decide for yourself if that's a good thing or a bad thing or not. However, the rapid change is our problem. We have many ecologists here to take this on further. The ecological system responds to climate change. It has successfully done so in the past. The fact that we're here is evidence that that does work. But it's the rate of change which is the issue now. It's the rate of change that we have to address, and it's the rate of change which is a threat to us. And what I'm hoping that we can do tonight from this point on is yes, we talk about the science, let's talk about it some more, but think about what do we do about this practically? What can we do about this? It's a political issue and a political question and a moral question. I hope that we have some questions from you that allow us to address those, what to me are some of the most critical issues that we have to discuss.
I'm going to ask others on the panel to comment. As I'm going through the questions, many of them do come back to this theme again and again, that we have heard that there is not consensus on this issue. We have heard many scientists speak that there is debate about whether or not, first, there is global warming and whether humans are contributing to that global warming. We have a golden opportunity to have our own set of scientists here, that at least we can poll this gathering and on their opinion and see if we have consensus among them. So other panelists would like to speak to the large question about global warming and Al Gore's depiction of the degree of consensus among scientists.
Is this mic live? Can you hear me? I'd like to say, in answer to that, part of that question was about, well, is it a hoax? And I think that right now, there's a strong consensus in the scientific community about global warming being real and about human-based causes being a big part of it. And people who think that that could be part of a hoax really don't understand how science works. There is a streak of sort of revolutionary aspect to the way science works, in that the way to become a star in science is to show that the conventional wisdom, the consensus, is wrong. If you have some key bit of data, some key argument, a better way of looking at the data that shows that what everybody else thought was wrong, you become a hero. It happened in the mid-1960s with something that was in that film. The consensus had been that continents didn't move. When enough things came together to show that there's a better way of looking at it, that the continents did move, those people they get to write their ticket to whatever kinds of science jobs they want. So the idea that somehow scientists together could be collaborating in some big hoax Well, given that most of them are academics, the idea that we could all cooperate and collaborate together to do anything is somewhat hard to get over right to begin with. But fundamentally, the science enterprise in the United States just couldn't tolerate that, because the payoff to show that the consensus was wrong is just too high. It's just too high. So if we are wrong about global warming, and one thing about science is to know that you never really know anything 100%. If we are wrong, it's because of the best honest attempts, not because of some payoff. A second thing I'd like to say about a way of thinking of this is that, particularly when you come from an economic point of view, there seems to be an approach of we should not try to do anything about global warming unless you pass an extremely high threshold of proof that it's happening and that humans are causing it. And I question the wisdom of putting the burden of proof that way. I guess the way I think of it is that if I lived next door to you and I like to burn stuff in my backyard and the smoke came over your backyard and over your house and your kids were breathing it and it went into your house, where do you think the burden of proof should be? Should you be really sure that there's nothing wrong with that smoke? And should you have to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that there's nothing wrong with that smoke before you'd ask me, hey, could you not do that before it would become worth it to try to do something about that? Where should the burden of proof be? And the reason I like that analogy is because take those kids in your backyard and just make them your grandkids that aren't there yet. That's the issue here. We're doing something that has consequences for future generations. Do we need to know beyond a shadow of a doubt that it's what we're doing that's causing these problems before we act? Or should we be willing to act because, well, the best evidence suggests that that's we're causing a problem? When should the threshold of acting be?
I would add to that, I guess, that where the controversy lies in large part is the fact that what we're dealing with is correlational data. So anytime you have a correlation, it can be difficult to look at cause and effect. You can't do an experiment with the globe and add some CO2 into it and then see what happens. And so we're trying to draw inferences from a necessarily messy and complicated system. And there's going to be debate about how things fit together. And that's currently where we're at. People are fairly well convinced, scientific minds who've examined this problem are fairly well convinced that the world is warming, and demonstrably so. Debate pops up when you start talking about what caused it, and the finger pointing towards human activities is I think justified, because we have had a large and growing influence on atmospheric conditions. And as a biologist, Michael Crichton would call me a climate impactologist. I don't study climate change, I study the impacts of it, which is absolutely true. However, as a biologist, as an ecologist, we've started to notice some really bizarre things popping up in the world, like birds having ranges that are much different than they have been historically. And when I say historically, over the last 1,000 years, breeding times decidedly different than history tells us, and flowering times very different. So there are lots of clues out there that indicate that the globe is warming. Certainly the debate gets interesting and somewhat controversial when you talk about the causes, and the cautionary tale that Dr. Smallwood mentions, I think, is a good one to keep in mind. Where do we want to put our action? How do we want to respond to this change that we're currently in the midst of?
Thank you. I'll ask my own question. This is a forum which is part of the Jepson Leadership School series on science, society, and leadership. This seems like an important problem. Do scientists need better leadership? Can't you get together, scientists, and give us an answer to what seems to be an important but straightforward question?
Well, I will say this, that scientists are historically a fairly unmanageable bunch of people. We don't like to be managed, for one thing. It is sometimes difficult to come to a consensus. on a very complicated issue like this. But the evidence is quite clear that beyond any reasonable doubt that there's global warming. It's really a question of what is causing this. In terms of leadership, then you start getting into a much more, I guess, human activity, something that's a lot less based in something that scientists are going to be comfortable with, which is, we're accustomed to working with data. We're accustomed to going out and finding particular things that we can put onto graphs and we can correlate. Leadership isn't something that we're very good at, the truth is. And that is perhaps it's a failing of scientists, perhaps it's a failing of human nature in general. But we do have an issue with dealing with the leadership issue. And so I would certainly plead guilty to something like that. I'm not really sure what the solution is, though.
Can I say something about that? I think part of the problem that we have as scientists is informing policymakers. It's different mindsets. A policymaker has to make a decision, and on the basis of that decision, a lot of money is spent, and that's your money, your taxpayers, most of you, and that's important. But as scientists, we're more concerned about being accurate, even better, hopefully precise in our statements and our measurements, and yet the policymakers need to make decisions. And that process of communication fails so many times. And that's, I think, is one of our major problems in looking to leadership in policy making, and also in cutting through the hyperbole that we find within, especially in the environmental movement, where we have James Lovelock, who many of you will know, I'm sure, is who came up first with the idea of Gaia, that we have a self-sustaining biological system on Earth, has just written a book, The Revenge of Gaia, which is telling us that within 100 years, we'll all, at least those of us currently in the northern hemisphere, will be living in small communities huddled around somewhere in the Arctic peninsulas. And that will be all that will be left of our current civilization. Now, he's a well-renowned scientist, so I'm not mocking him in any sense. He's one of my heroes in a broader sense. But we have that hyperbole of suggesting the world is coming to an end. And on the other, we have, perhaps within some of the extremes of the current administration, those who are telling us it's no problem at all, we can just ignore it and go on as we are at the moment, and it's all just a conspiracy by the scientists. How do you cut through that? Where does the leadership come in cutting through that scientific and political hyperbole to find a consensus opinion and act on it and spend money on it? And that I'm not giving you a solution, but I don't think it's all the scientists' problem. It's a communication problem, and that shouldn't be a surprise, since most of our problems in the world are based on the same sort of foundation.
Back to the actual questions, sorry about that. But a very closely related question. Now that the problem has been scientifically proven that it exists, isn't the real problem how do we market this message to the public? Any thoughts?
I think one of the things that is, and it's perhaps a cynical viewpoint, but perhaps one of the best ways of marketing this, if you will, is to show people how it hits them in the pocketbook, ultimately. And it's sad to say, but people really are going to respond to things like that. And that's where the economists are going to come in. People are going to show that there is a definite economic consequence to our actions. I think one of the messages that Gore gets across in his film is a very powerful one, that is that of the moral message. But when it comes to taking political action, I think that's something that they need to have it demonstrated to them that this is something that really does affect them in a very immediate and a very real and consequential way. So what I think we need is, and it's getting back to what David had mentioned, talking about communication. Scientists tend to be on one side, and we deal with data, and as the consequence of data, we tend to pile up a lot of data. But on the other hand, we're looking for people who are going to come up with solutions that are going to be much more generalized, and we need something in the middle that's going to connect the two. And I think that's where we're really lacking, is that middle ground.
Yes.
As a follow-on to that, I think that it is also helpful in terms of getting the message to the public to say that not only are there negative consequences for not doing anything, but to talk about a positive message. This is, I don't want to say that you can solve any problem, but you can greatly reduce the consequence of this problem. And I think that was one of the parts of the film that was pretty good. If you go to the Department of Energy, United States Department of Energy, and search around on their website, you can get an estimate of the metric tons of carbon per person per year put out in the by the average person in the United States and by other countries. For the past few years, the United States is running at about 20 metric tons. The United Kingdom, Belgium, several other European countries are running around 10, around half. France and Sweden, a few other of those countries, are running more in the vicinity of 5.5 to 6. I was in the United Kingdom several times in the past couple of years, and I was in France and I was in Germany, and I was not struck by the horrible sacrifices as people were suffering to have such a low carbon footprint. So it strikes me that it's not that hard if we pay attention to it. And as another kicker on that, do you remember not too long ago there was this tremendous electricity crisis in California? And right about that time was when our vice president talked about conservation as, well, it may be a fine personal ethic, but it's hardly a policy. With no support from the federal government whatsoever, in fact, with the idea of conservation being ridiculed at the federal level, California reduced its electrical consumption by over 10% just with conservation measures at that time. So I think that in addition to talking about the consequences for our real lives, it's important in terms of getting public action to say, yes, and there is stuff we can do. There is a positive view, there are positive changes we can make that actually will make a difference.
I think it's important to recognize that the public is far more receptive to starting to deal with this problem that's commonly understood. There's been polls released in the last couple of years showing that over 80% of Americans want cooperation with other countries on things like Kyoto and want some kinds of controls to begin to be put in place on greenhouse gas emissions. And the partisan gap is actually smaller than you might think. It's about 81% Republicans, about 89% Democrats. So I think the image that there's this vast majority of sort of dumb Americans out there who are totally oblivious to this, I think is an incorrect image. Unfortunately, politicians don't respond very often to sort of soft policy preferences. So it's possible, on one hand, it's true that 80% of people at least support some action. On the other hand, it's also true there's probably not a single politician in Congress who thinks they're going to lose an election this year because of their stance on this issue. So what would need to happen is eventually what politics rewards is not opinion, but organizing. And who's better organized enough to actually begin to carry some clout. And I think you have to do that both at the grassroots level, but also at the top-down level. So if I were Al Gore, I would be trying to butter up prominent Republicans and others who are willing to take the kind of stance that he took to get more top-down leadership. Because if it's just one person, if it's just the Al Gore show, it's not going to go very far, because eventually people will get sick of Al Gore, as I think it's already been proven in the past. So.
Let me add something to that, if I would. Sometimes it is just one person. There's a person who appears in the film, Senator James Inhofe of Oklahoma. He says global warming is a hoax, and he is a very important one person. He is currently the chair of the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, and that is the committee that has jurisdiction over the Climate Stewardship Act. And this is the major legislative proposal that would put a cap and trade system in place for carbon dioxide emissions in this country. And that legislation is not moving. Now, in 2003, it got 43 senators to sign on. It got a very positive reception, and Senators McCain and Lieberman vowed to keep going forward with that legislation. But with someone who thinks that global warming is a hoax at one particular checkpoint in the United States Senate, no action on that bill is happening until that particular leadership changes. And obviously, we have an opportunity very soon to have that particular leadership change.
Dr. Yates.
I wanted to add one thing. If you saw in the movie, Al Gore suggested several things that you can do to lower your carbon imprint. And there's other things that you can do, actually, if you're impatient with the pace of political action on this issue. Pretty soon, some states, as you mentioned, are going to be trading carbon dioxide permits. And individuals can go out and purchase those things. And they're not that expensive per ton, so you could figure out, your carbon imprint, try to take steps to reduce it, but also directly reduce it by buying, and this is an issue that I'm particularly interested in, something I'm studying, by buying the pollution essentially right out of the air. That's things that you can do right now, not for carbon dioxide, but for other pollutants, but very soon my guess is you'll be able to do that for carbon dioxide too. So if you are impatient, there is no reason to wait.
Thank you. We have a cluster of questions asking about economic implications. Currently, public policy views economic growth as increases in real GDP. How does the reliance on this standard influence environmental policy? How can economics, here's a good question, how can economics help solve the crisis? Second question, if we put stricter environmental regulations on our businesses, they might outsource those jobs and pollute more overseas. How could we prevent this from happening? Simple questions.
Well, the second question you worry about a lot more in a situation where you have local pollutants. Carbon dioxide is a global pollutant, so any damages, any carbon dioxide emitted anywhere is going to hurt all of us. So I'm not too worried about that particular problem. What was the first question?
The first question is the general concern about what we value, what our whole system values, which is economic growth. How can we integrate a positive environmental policy with our quest for economic growth?
Go ahead.
I was going to say, the slide about the gold bars and the planet highlights a fallacy, and that is, if we impose some sort of controls on carbon dioxide, we will stifle economic growth. And in fact, that's the import of the question. I have a number for you. It's $4 billion. That sounds like a lot of money to me. The state's energy modelers in California have said that $4 billion in income will be generated in that state by industries that will spring up to help the state meet its carbon dioxide standards in 2020. That doesn't seem to me to be incompatible with economic growth. That seems to be the kind of ingenuity that he's talking about at the end of the film. So I thoroughly reject the premise that imposing controls on carbon dioxide is somehow incompatible with economic growth.
I would add, I do think we have to begin to challenge the idea that the GDP growth is the standard for evaluating the economy, and begin to look at more qualitatively what's happening. The growth rate may be the same whether we put another 100 million cars on the road or whether we shift to mass transit. Economically, the results may be the same, but qualitatively, it's going to be a huge difference both in the way of life and the ecological impact. So I think we have to get beyond this big single number which dominates most of our discussion in macroeconomics and look more specifically at what are we growing in. Is that a good idea? What are the pros and cons of growing in each particular sector? And there's some things we should be growing on, some things we should be shrinking in. But I think we do have to move to a different standard if we're going to address this problem and probably others as well.
I think the economics profession is moving that way, and a lot of people are doing work along the lines that you're describing to try to think of some other measures or a better aggregate measure of the health of the economy and the ecosystem put together. But I think there will be significant costs, so I disagree a little bit with what Joel was saying about how costly it is to do that. And certainly there will be growth industries, but other industries will certainly be very hard to cut back on their carbon emissions.
Thank you. We have a few specific questions here. I'd like to get to as many as I can. There's some specific ones. Maybe in thinking of these questions, they have to do perhaps with myths or rumors about the science and the process. This question, there are stories that several scientists who claim they lost federal funding tenure when they published or attempted to publish research evidence on global warming. To what extent does this occur? And what are their legal remedies? Has the panel heard of such attempts to steer the directions of science?
I will say that I don't believe, I personally don't know anybody who has ever lost a grant because they have decided to publish their results that there is in fact global warming. I have never heard of such a thing happening. Certainly I've never heard of anybody losing their tenure or anything of this nature. Now, there may be instances where there have been changes at the very highest levels of government where you're looking at policymakers that have been appointed, but I believe that the rank and file scientists have been pretty much, they're going to report their results, whatever those results are. They're going to be quite honest about those results. And I don't believe that there has been any major shift in the composition of the science community as a result of their advocacy of the global warming issue.
I think that one issue that might come to mind, there was something in the news about a scientist who had his lab notebooks confiscated by a prominent politician, and I believe this person worked for the
Michael Mann.
USGS.
Yeah, it was Michael Mann, and it was
Okay.
Joe Barton, Senator Barton, who. Yeah.
So it happens, but it's relatively rare, and I think, as was mentioned earlier, scientists, if you can knock down a theory and stake a claim for yourself, either pro or con, you're going to do yourself and your career a pretty decent service. And so if you can somehow totally disprove this idea that global warming is happening, and have incontrovertible evidence, then you're going to further your own career. If you have incontrovertible evidence that there is global warming going on, you're going to provided you're being a good scientist, you're going to get it out there. Those consequences are really rare, and in fact, there's a lot of funding to examine this thing that's going on with the climate and how it's changing in a scientific context.
And I don't disagree with what he said, but I have been aware that there's a difference between working in a university where we have academic freedom to say what we want and working for government. And there are a number of, you saw James, I think it was James Hansen, government scientist, who very recently, again, it's not so much what he publishes, if that is strictly controlled, but his public appearances and public statements are strongly censured, and he has been censured, and other scientists have certainly been told, not just in this field. Mike and I have been teaching together at various times in our environmental senior seminar. One of the things I did with the students was last year, it doesn't matter, was genetically modified organisms. You look at GMOs and you find the same issue. With government scientists who tend to suggest that maybe we do need to have some caution about genetically modified foods and organisms and our use of them. So whereas universities are free from that sort of pressure, if your boss is in government, then you do come under that pressure. And I've certainly heard a lot of stories about scientists who have come under what, from their perspective, is undue pressure. Clearly from a political perspective, there's a bigger agenda perhaps. But so it's complex.
Thank you. Another relatively specific question. What level of emissions would we have to reach to reverse the effects of global warming? Is the 1970s level sufficient?
Yeah, if we go down to 1970 levels, we will start to reverse the process. But carbon dioxide has a long residence time in the atmosphere, and so although the carbon dioxide is here now, is going to be around in 200, 300 years' time, so it takes some time for that carbon dioxide to decrease, and that's important to remember. If I could just give you a sort of tongue-in-cheek thought about this one as well. When I said at the beginning that our ultimate destiny here is an ice age, from a geologist's perspective, we're heading back at some time in the future into the ice age that we've been in for some time. Carbon dioxide is not a pollutant. It's a wonderful resource we should be holding on to and storing away somewhere against that time when we really need to warm the atmosphere, along with all the methane we can get hold of. So we're being profligate in our use of this carbon dioxide. It's our precious commodity.
Thank you.
Well, most of the areas that will be flooded are blue state areas anyway, so it's just going to be an opportunity for redistricting. Yeah.
Moving on to political issues. Let's not. As the hour grows late, I have several, big questions really in my hand. You can't help but watch the film and feel disturbed by it, that it's kind of a gloomy picture being painted, and it has raised several questions such as, what are the future climate changes? Are we doomed to a coming ice age, in your opinion?
Yes.
And can we possibly recover the losses in ice masses in the Antarctic and elsewhere? What does the future hold for us, in the opinion of the panel?
Okay. I'm sorry, it's a geology question. Once we lose the ice, it's much harder to get back. And the reason for this is what we call various feedbacks in the system. One of those feedbacks he mentioned passing in the film is that when you take ice reflects a lot of the sun's energy. And when you take the ice away and it's replaced by vegetation or even brown earth and mess and muck, it starts to absorb the sun's heat, and so it starts to warm both the earth and the atmosphere above it. And so once the ice goes, the earth gets a lot warmer because it's absorbing sunlight and re-radiating that sunlight as infrared radiation. That was once just reflected right back into space again. So once the ice is gone, it's very hard to get back. And we run into potentially this runaway effect where we see increased warming above that we might have expected just from carbon dioxide alone. And that's one of the issues, also the complexities of the climate system, is our still lack of full understanding of all the feedbacks and the intensity of those feedbacks, and the possibility that there are tipping points built into this climate system. And if we move over one of those tipping points, we could see sudden changes in climate. I've already said that we're looking at much more rapid climate change now than our ecosystem has had to respond to at any time in the last tens of hundreds of thousands of years. There may be yet tipping points in the system. So a point that I think that Peter made earlier on is this idea of the precautionary principle is probably a wise one for us to take here, and to take action now rather than waiting until we have to take action because of some precipitous event which takes place, which has an immediate and drastic impact on our economies and on the environment.
Thank you. We have spoken of ways we can promote positive changes. We've talked about, and the film as well speaks of things that individuals can do to reduce their environmental impact. Professor Smallwood mentioned possibly political interventions which could be taken as well. A question put to the panel is, what organizations do you feel are best positioned to influence change in global and national climate policy? Recommendations, I think, is what we're asking
Government
for.
of the United States.
Best positioned, I suppose so. Most likely to influence change in.
I've gotten much more optimistic in the past few years. I worked for Senator Lieberman for the academic year, most of the academic year 2003, 2004, and it was a really interesting experience. But on the global warming front, I was not so optimistic coming out of there. And what I see happening on a state-by-state basis leaves me optimistic. And so in terms of institutions or organizations, where I see the activity happening now in terms of the United States is in state legislatures, one by one, that will eventually push the whole country in that direction. So the best organizations now, I think, are state by state.
Well, I think one of the things that's being tested right now, this premise is being tested right now in the United States Supreme Court. There is a case pending before the court called Massachusetts versus EPA, where the EPA has said quite clearly, we have no intention of regulating carbon dioxide as an air pollutant. And that is under the Clean Air Act, which Al Gore mentioned in the film. And the EPA has drawn a line in the sand and said, we will not, in response to a petition from Massachusetts and a number of the other states that Peter has mentioned, we will not regulate carbon dioxide as an air pollutant, so they may well be forced to do this. I know I heard that shudder in the crowd when we said government of the United States, because at present it's the states taking the lead, as Peter said, and the federal government is doing virtually nothing on carbon dioxide, but they may well be forced to do it. And this is one vehicle in which they may well be forced to do it. The argument in this case will be later on in this Supreme Court term.
Well, you raise I want to sneak in one more question. You raise it in your response. Why has the U.S. lacked initiative in developing a global warming policy?
I think there's
Inertia.
yeah, I think talking about apocalyptic scenarios really there's a huge resistance to even thinking about things like that, and there's a huge, I think, psychological commitment to the status quo that's difficult to shake, and it's very, very unsettling to think about these possibilities, even if they are just possibilities, because it disturbs your worldview. And I think it's understandable a lot of people aren't anxious to go there, especially when they have very pressing other problems to deal with. So I think it's a tough one politically, because I'm not saying it's impossible, but I don't see how either average voter or average politician is going to decide to prioritize this over some other issues with which this is competing, and really become a key thing that could hold the feet to fire a politician on and you could lose an election on. I don't see a clear-cut way for that to happen other than to try and do all the organizing that you possibly can. I think it's absolutely right that you have to have some achievable successes at the state and local level you can point to begin to build some measure of momentum, and you need to have politicians who go beyond their mandate of just winning elections, go beyond that and actually be thinking about the public good and being willing to stick out their necks. And the paradox of Al Gore was he's saying this stuff now, but what happened when he was vice president? Not a lot. And so it's a difficult trap that politicians get sucked into. So I think it's a hard one.
I would say also, I'm going to take issue with the premise of the question again. The states here in the United States have done quite a bit on global warming policy, and in fact, California is a national and international leader. It just enacted into law a comprehensive package of global warming controls that's a model for the nation and for the rest of the world. Yes, at the national level, we lack the leadership, we lack the political will right now to get things going, but there are very positive developments happening in the states, and California is one of the largest economies in the world by itself. That's not, its package of controls is not something to sneeze at.
I would add one more thing. I think it's not just simply government. It's one of the problems with government and elected society is that we have a tendency to think in terms of electoral cycles, and that's our timeline. And so we need some mechanism by which we're looking further than how long it takes for somebody to get reelected. And to me, that points towards industry. The people who actually are going to be producing the cars and the people who produce the power, these are the organizations that are going to have to be looking in terms of 10 years, 20 years, 30 years in terms of their infrastructure. It has to be made clear to them that it is in their long-term best interest to enact these changes. And that's something that goes beyond what somebody who's elected to the House of Representatives for 2 years or the Senate for 6 years is going to be thinking. And I think it's going to be a kind of a feedback system of its own between the states, the federal government, and these industries. There's going to have to be some kind of a push being made into these industries, but the industries ultimately are going to be the ones that have to make those decisions and have to implement the decisions. It's not going to be the states. It's not going to be the state of Virginia, because they don't build these big power plants. It's going to be Dominion Virginia Power or somebody like this. So we need to make it clear to them that there is a carrot out there for them to go for.
There too, there's also a lot of positive movement. 10 years ago, there was an organization called the Global Climate Coalition that was basically the industry voice on global warming, and they were the biggest deniers of them all. And now you have major extraction industries. You have even utilities stepping up to the plate and saying this is a major problem, we have to do something about it. 2 days ago, Pacific Gas and Electric Company, one of the 3 largest utilities in California, announced that it was perfectly willing to go along with caps on carbon dioxide in California. So there has been positive change on that front, and I agree with you wholeheartedly that it has to be industry. You know, the automakers are fighting California's emission standards tooth and nail, and they're currently in federal court in California. Every single automaker that wants to sell you a hybrid automobile is in California right now fighting higher emission standards. Can't have it both ways.
I would add not just industry. I think Al Gore ended that movie on a particularly interesting note. I mean, he made it was a moral call to arms. And I just right before I came here tonight, I went on the web and I pulled up climatecare.org, which is a group of evangelicals who have at the National Association of Evangelicals in October of 2004 put out a call to action. Freudian slip there. I apologize. But essentially, they make this climate change issue a moral one because who's going to get hardest by climate change? It's going to be the poor. And what is our duty then in an ethical and moral setting to deal with that? And they state in their document that for most of us, until recently, this has not been treated as a pressing issue or major priority. Indeed, many of us have required considerable convincing before becoming persuaded that climate change is a real problem and that it ought to matter to us as Christians. And yet, some very prominent evangelicals came on board, signed this document, and in many ways, I think that yes, industry, yes, politics, yes, scientists are important in this discussion, but as Al Gore ended this movie, this is an ethical issue. And the question is, how do we deal with it? And I think evangelicals, who traditionally have been on the right on a lot of these issues, are finding themselves with tree-hugging green environmentalists because it is an issue that's going to affect those that are least capable of dealing with the problems that come their way.
I would say that ultimately what it comes down to is we have to change the way that we think. Ultimately, about so many parts of our lives, we have to change the way that we think about how we are stewards of the environment, but we also have to think in terms of changing the way that we think about industry, the economy, everything that we do. We have to be prepared to take a step back and look at things differently. We tend to get locked in as humans have a bad tendency to get locked into a particular mode of thinking. And it's hard to get taken out of that comfort zone. But
One more.
sooner or later, we're going to have to.
One more comment?
Last comment I would say is that if you are a voter in Virginia, write your governor, write your state legislator. It probably won't do much good for the state legislature in this state, but write your governor. Several of the states that have made real progress, it started with an executive order. And for those students who are here who are not registered in Virginia, write your congressman or your governor for wherever you're registered. Because that's, if we're talking about states moving, the states need to hear from you.
Well, you've been very patient. I just want to take a moment here and thank our panel for joining us this evening. I find it very reassuring that experts such as these are working on this problem and are taking it very seriously. I also appreciate all of you coming and facing this movie. It is an unpleasant bit of information, but it's gratifying and reassuring that so many of you here are willing to confront this issue and potentially work it through. Thank you, and drive your hybrid home carefully.
No chips, nachos, things like that.